Welcome everyone to Vancouver. I'm Chris Fair, President of Resonance, and joining me today is Brent Toderian, founder of Toderian Urban Works, a city urbanist planner with more than 28 years of experience. Brent's worked with cities all over the world, and happy to have him here joining us after 3 days of talks and discussions with city leaders around the world to come back home to Vancouver and chat with Brent for our last session today on Keys to the Future City. Welcome, Brent.
Nice to see you again, Chris.
Likewise. So tell me a little bit about, we're going to get into, as we've talked to people all over the world over the last 3 days, much has been about the pandemic and what that has caused and challenges for the city. But I wanted to sort of back up a little bit and talk, what were we talking about in 2019 before COVID and some of the key issues that you saw and were really championing as it related to cities?
Well, it's easy to forget that we were already in crisis mode before this pandemic crisis arrived. 2020 was the year of the pandemic. 2019 was the year of the climate emergency declaration. The big thing that year was city after city. Vancouver was the first here in Canada. I advised the first Ontario city that did it, council declaring a climate emergency. And more important than that symbolic but important gesture is, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to do business differently as a city hall? Because this is an emergency. How are you going to prove you understand what the word means? And what it means is almost everything you're doing, you have to be rethinking. You have to be doing differently. If you're doing everything the same in an emergency, you don't understand what the word emergency means. And that was just one crisis we were facing. For 5 or 6 years, I've been talking about the 5 crises that our cities were facing around the world. And I started doing this in the context of Vancouver. I was chief planner here in Vancouver for 6 years. But it really relates to my work on almost every continent on the planet. Our cities were facing, but also the solutions for at least 5 crises. The climate crisis, which is obvious, the homelessness and affordability crisis that was facing many expensive cities, certainly like Vancouver. The public health crisis that we were already facing before this pandemic, public health in the form of obesogenic environments where we were basically designing activity out of our daily lives and facing epidemic levels of preventable diseases like obesity and diabetes, and a lot of these things in kids, not just adults. So we were already facing a public health crisis based on how we were designing our cities and more accurately our suburbs. So that was a crisis even before the virus. And ironically, we were talking about viruses even then. I did a panel, a keynote with Dr. Roberta Bondar, the very famous scientist and Canadian astronaut. And all she did was talk about in our conversation about sustainability was ticks. Because in Ottawa, climate change had been expanding the habitat of ticks and thus the expansion of Lyme disease. And we weren't paying enough attention to viruses as a consequence of climate change. So I already had viruses on my radar screen as one of the many consequences of climate change and that crisis. So we were talking about public health as a crisis. We were also talking about the demographic crisis, the aging population, the challenge of essentially chasing and trying to keep the millennials, and the socioeconomic crises, issues of racism and economic discrimination and all forms of intolerance that are playing out in cities and affected by the way we do our cities. So we were facing all of these crises already. I call them now, once the pandemic hit, I called them our pre-existing conditions. Our American friends love to talk about pre-existing conditions in the context of whether you have healthcare coverage. Our cities had pre-existing conditions prior to this pandemic, crises we were already facing. And so I and others were almost annoying in our levels of loudly calling for solutions and approaches to addressing the pandemic in a way that also recognized and understood our pre-existing conditions. Because frankly, if we went the other way, if we went in the direction of exacerbating our pre-existing conditions as a result of how we responded to the pandemic because we were afraid, we were going to end up with a worse future after the pandemic instead of a better one. So the year before the pandemic was about the climate emergency. The 5 years, 10 years, 20 years before that have been about all of our pre-existing crises that were already at crisis level. And then the pandemic just felt like one more layer. and not necessarily even a new layer, just a variation, a variant of the old crises that was suddenly rearing its head and illustrating to us how we were taking lightly a lot of the costs and consequences of habitat, urban habitat expansion, exacerbating the climate emergency, et cetera. So we were already using words like crisis. We were already using words like emergency. And that's a strange thing for me because I'm a city planner. I was trained to be patient. Our solutions would take a long time, and we had to be patient. But over the last 10 years of my career, of my almost 30 years, I've stopped using the word patience almost entirely, and I started to talk about strategic impatience, and then I started just saying crisis, because that's the place that our cities have been in long before this pandemic.
So let's talk about, COVID, and you look at that as layering on this additional crisis on top of all of these pre-existing conditions. I mean, in some ways, has that helped galvanize us to take action on some of these things, or do you think it's made things just worse across the board?
I don't know if it's either one entirely. I think we hoped that it would galvanize us, and I think we failed that test to a large extent. Our ability to show that we can come together and solve big crises and challenges hasn't really worked out that way. But in the context of cities and city building, I think what it did a number of things that were really important. First of all, it immediately revealed something about the nature of our cities that we already knew, those of us who've been trying to make cities better, which is that we actually don't have a lot of space in cities. It revealed that we had surrendered, is the way that I put it. We had already surrendered in our cities to cars. We had surrendered most of our public space, much of our public life, to space to park and to drive cars. And we knew that already, and we were already struggling with that as a major challenge that cities were facing. How do we reprioritize back for people and away from surrendering all of our space, all of our energy, all of our budget, public municipal budgets, to cars? How do we get that back? How do we take that back? And then suddenly we had to be 2 meters apart from each other constantly in our public realm, in our public life. And it made it even more obvious that the sidewalk was tight and the street was filled with things other than people, and how we had to walk out onto the roadway to give our neighbors space when we're walking on the sidewalk. And by the way, that wasn't safe because there might have been fewer cars initially driving during the beginning of the pandemic, but they were driving faster. And there were actually more collisions because people were driving fast, because now the design speed seemed faster because there was less friction. So all we had to see was evidence of this surrendering that we had done. It wasn't that we had too many people in our cities, it's that we had too many cars. One of the first narratives that came out during the pandemic is, isn't density bad? Right. Isn't density bad for the pandemic? Governor Cuomo in New York came out with that statement, and an organization in New York asked me to write an op-ed about, respectfully at that time, because Governor Cuomo was still popular, "Dear Governor, could you please stop saying density is the problem? It's not. Crowding is the problem." And crowding happens when you try to fit a lot of people into not much space. And when you've given up all that space to cars, crowding happens more often. But it was also crowding on the subways. It was crowding on transit. It was crowding in events that we had to be careful of. So one of the most important narratives initially was density is not the problem. As a matter of fact, many of the densest cities in the world weathered the pandemic initially much better, because often density comes with all the supports and services that allow you to actually handle lockdowns and public health emergencies. So density was never the problem, but crowding and how you address it and manage it was critical. So how do we make more space in our sidewalks? Well, we reconsider the curb line. We reconsider the on-street parking, some lanes of traffic. We give more space for people to get out and recreate and take air, as they say, and get mental and physical exercise and respite from the isolation of a lockdown. And we make space eventually for the restaurants so that they don't go out of business, so we can eat outdoors safely. And we manage our public transit through every second seat being closed and loading from the back of buses and mask mandates on transit so that we can keep transit functioning and playing its critically important role in regions. So there were all these immediate observations based on needing to find space. And a lot of that found space was clawing back the space that we had surrendered from the cars. Now, at the same time as all of those details were happening, and by the way, there was also details like we suddenly recognized how important balconies are in apartments, because getting out of the house when you're in lockdown sometimes meant just going out onto the balcony. And boy, am I glad I have a balcony. And is my balcony big enough? We started to think about rules and regulations around the creation of balconies when we create density, for example, in cities. So there were all sorts of small details in our homes, in our travel, in our public realm and public design that we immediately started to observe differently because of the pandemic and the need to physically distance. But at the same time, we suddenly got into some really big conversations, and many of us, myself included, were trying to force this conversation about the future of our cities, our downtowns, our regions post-pandemic. Because I was worried about what I was calling the self-fulfilling prophecy of more sprawl and more car dependency. You know, this narrative that transit's no longer safe, so let's cut transit funding and widen the roads. That's a very easy thing to do when you're in a fear position and not making smart public policy. Or the idea that I want to move from the inner city or the downtown where it's crowded to out in the suburbs where there's wide open spaces, and suddenly we've exacerbated sprawl. So we've poured gasoline on the two biggest issues for all those pre-existing conditions I talked about: land use sprawl and car-dependent infrastructure. We double down on those because we think that's what people will want coming out of the pandemic. Both of those, though, would be a race to the bottom, a worst-case scenario, throwing gasoline on the fire, whatever your metaphor is. It started to be referred to in cities, that's the car-led recovery. We can't have a car-led recovery. We can't let the cars all come back. Because frankly, if they all come back and we're driving even more and we're sprawling even more, then all of those pre-existing conditions get worse. And ironically, as I said, one of the consequences of that climate emergency is more and worse pandemics. So it became very important to proactively talk about what we can't do as a response to the pandemic, what we can't let happen. And people like me were loud to the point of risking obnoxiousness to make sure that public policy people and public discourse out there in the media wasn't having these lazy conversations about density being bad, sprawl being good, public transit being bad, cars being good, because all of those narratives, first of all, they're incorrect. You're still the most dangerous place you could have been in the pandemic was in a car, statistically, because you're far more likely to die of a car crash. So none of those narratives were true, but they're easy and they're good for clickbait. So we had to be pushing back vigorously in the early, probably the first 6 months of the pandemic. So there were small, detailed conversations happening, and then big systemic conversations about the future of downtown, the future of sprawl, the future of cars and public transit, et cetera.
Isn't there also a potential positive narrative in this as it relates to, I mean, you've been a long time advocate of taking space back from cars and returning it to people. And the pandemic sort of necessitated that, where we've seen all kinds of cities around the world where suddenly tactile urbanism, placemaking is flourishing. We're creating outdoor patios, cafes, closing blocks. I mean, is that just a temporary reaction to the pandemic, or is it a potential new narrative and appreciation for public space in our cities?
Well, I like to think that, I always say that once your eyes are open to the way that cities work, you can never close them again. You can never not see it. And I like to think that we're always going to remember how we felt when the sidewalk is too tight and there wasn't enough room for pedestrians. So I wonder how that's going to translate in planning departments all over the world about our standards for sidewalk width, our standards for safe bike lanes for cycling travel, our requirements for balconies and home-based offices for working from home. Are all of these things going to change? In the smart cities, in my observation, they are. Suddenly, everything is being reconsidered in light of what we learned during the pandemic. And then there's other cities that assume it's over and everything we learned we can forget. And my technical term for those cities is dumb cities. They're not learning. We have many, I know we're going to talk a little later about some of the most inspiring cities in the world, but one of the most inspiring and important things I saw, particularly in European cities, including some of the European cities that I advise, is that there was immediate conversation about the pre-existing condition. In many cases, it was air pollution in European cities, and how they already had a 5-year plan for urban biking, for adding public realm space, expanding parks, widening sidewalks, pedestrianizing streets. They already had a 5-year plan. They did it all in 5 weeks during the pandemic instead. They basically, there's a brilliance to the idea that says we already knew that it was a good idea. We didn't have to have that debate. We're just doing it faster now because it also happens to address the pandemic, but it addresses our pre-existing conditions and make our cities better long-term anyway. So we're going to succeed. Our cities are going to be better as a result of what we learned and not worse. So there have been many inspiring examples like that, particularly in European cities, not enough in North American cities. But that gives me a lot of hope, a lot of optimism. And then you've got some very specific things that have happened. The bike boom, for example. We were already talking about an urban cycling boom for about 5 years now, maybe even 5 to 10 years. The big growth in urban biking. And 5 years before, nobody was talking about urban biking and looking longingly at cities like Amsterdam or Utrecht. But suddenly, cities were all talking about urban biking. So we were already talking about this urban biking boom. But it went like this to like this. It took off like a rocket during the pandemic. And a lot of cities capitalized with the thing that's necessary to make that shift permanent, which is bike infrastructure. Paris being a great example of suddenly Paris is a city for bikes now because they built a lot of safe bike infrastructure. So it was a bike boom that was pandemic fueled, but the smart cities immediately capitalized on it by quickly building bike infrastructure. And now that bike boom stands a really good chance of being permanent. So there are some big boosts, things that hopefully we're going to be talking about as the pandemic being a turning point. But then there's other risks that we have to pay a lot of attention to, like public transit, for example. We can't correspondingly look back at the pandemic as the time when we lost 10 or 20 years of progress in ridership increase, and we didn't get that back. So that's where we have to fight vigorously to make sure that the bad things don't happen.
So much of this, positive or negative, really speaks to kind of just reacting to this crisis that we found ourselves in.
It's intention. Proactive is always best. The cities that weathered the pandemic best were the ones that already had a culture of quick action. Latin American cities were so good at that. They made almost immediate transformations because Latin American cities were already good at doing that. They had a culture of pilots and experimentation and seasonal transformations or weekend transformations, like Bogota being one of the very first cities, already having learned from Ciclovia. They transformed massive amounts of space for people on bikes and walking, etc. So there were already cities that had that culture, cities that had a culture of permanent changes in response to crises, like European cities. They did very well. So there was already this kind of momentum and that many cities were well positioned to take advantage of. And if they had the right culture and the right skill sets, they are winning. They're the winners in this pandemic from a city building perspective. And I don't mean to disrespect the life safety consequences of the pandemic. But from a city building perspective, they've made great progress. And that progress will probably be permanent. North American cities, that's a different conversation, and we can get to that. But certainly there are things to be optimistic about, but I've been speaking deliberately about proactively and at least with quick reaction time. If you can't be proactive, the next best thing is to react quickly. The cities that are doing that are doing better. And we have to do that because if we let the downward spiral happen, I've observed that too much in my 30 years of doing this. When downtowns start to spiral downward, it's hard to stop the bleeding. When negative forces start to affect things like sprawl, it can take decades to turn that back around again. So I've been very deliberate in our messaging. People have asked me, the number one question I've gotten asked during the pandemic is, are you optimistic or are you pessimistic about cities coming out of the pandemic? And I've always said, I'm neither. I'm determined. I'm a planner. I'm not a reactor. My profession is city planner, not city reactor. And so I am determined to make sure that the best consequences, positive consequences of the pandemic are realized and made permanent, and the worst consequences of the pandemic are at best temporary. And we have to be very deliberate and aggressive even with that kind of approach and strategy.
So if we want to be proactive and plan for the future, as you think about getting past the stage of just reacting to the circumstances we're in, I mean, what would you say are the top things that planners and cities should be focusing on now to deal with not only the conditions and what we've learned out of the pandemic, but those pre-existing conditions that you talked about before? If you looked at 2-3 years from now, what should we be thinking about today to be charting a better path for those pre-existing conditions and the conditions we find ourselves in now?
The best way I probably can answer that question is to think at different scales, because I think the answer is different at different scales. For example, I'm working right now, literally right now, I was working on it this morning, on 2 new regional plans in Australia. And the regional plans, they have cities, they have towns, villages, they have rural areas, they have urban, they have suburban, they have retrofitting communities, they have brand new communities. And so our strategies are different in all those different contexts, right? So you can have a conversation about, at that level, the conversation is about how do you keep making sure that a majority of the growth is infill, not greenfields, that you're growing up, not just out, that your growth is improving urban quality of life, making transit, walking, and biking better and more attractive as a choice, not car dependency. So it's about your regional growth patterns, right? And that's a conversation we always have at the regional level, but that's a huge, important conversation to have post-pandemic because of what I said about the fact that we might create our own self-fulfilling prophecy leading to more sprawl and more car dependency. So it's a perfect time to have a regional scale conversation about the future of transit, the future of urban versus suburban versus rural versus ex-urban being in the middle there. Because we have to make sure that we're doubling down on this notion of transit being critical for sustainable regions, walking and biking being the key to the 15-minute city or hyper-local living where you're not driving everywhere and your carbon footprint from your building form is less. So at all these different scales, it's playing out at the regional level. Then, when I'm talking about the neighborhood level, this is where the most recent thing we're talking about is the 15-minute city. I'm sure you've had that conversation with some of your guests. Whether you call it the 15-minute city, the city of short distances, complete communities, hyper-local. I used to call it the power of nearness. Just when everything's near, you don't have to worry about how to get far, and that's about mixed use, and it's about density, and it's about transit infrastructure. And transportation infrastructure. So whatever your model is for a neighborhood scale, to me, the challenge is, have we learned enough from these various pre-existing crises and this new one to actually stop just putting these things in your plan and then not seeing them actually realized? I've often said I'm good friends with the fellow who originated the 15-minute city concept, Carlos, in Paris. And he'll be the first to admit, and I've always said, that is far from a new idea. We've been talking about that kind of thing in other names, like complete communities, for decades. Melbourne's had the 20-minute neighborhoods for a few decades. In Vancouver, it's actually called the 5-minute city. So Paris wasn't the first to do it, but where I give Paris huge credit was by far, they were the best of any city I've ever seen at branding and packaging it. And then the mayor made it instrumental in her re-election campaign. And so put it on the front pages, so to speak, and made it part of her sales pitch for re-election. And when she was re-elected, she appointed a vice mayor of the 15-minute city and created infrastructure and leadership in the organization to actually make it happen. That's what's different. And that's what we need in our cities. I find old ideas all the time and rebrand them or try to rejuvenate them, because the key isn't new ideas. The key is to actually be far more persuasive and effective at actually implementing the ideas we've had for quite some time. Why Paris is special right now is because they packaged and branded it masterfully, and they're actually working hard at doing it. It's real. It's not just sitting on page 67 of their official plan, Collecting Dust, right? So I think at whatever scale you're operating at, regional scale all the way down to a street scale, where we're talking about making streeteries and on-street sidewalk space for restaurants permanent now, and should be talking about that. It's making sure that we haven't just addressed the pandemic moving forward, but we've used it to hyperinflate the conversation about the crises we already had. And maybe people will take the word crisis more seriously now that we've actually spent almost 2 years now faced with a real crisis that people haven't been able to ignore.
Isn't that maybe one of the rare silver linings coming out of this has been that we've gone through this global crisis together and this mass experimentation and knowledge sharing, and certainly the whole premise behind World City and starting this platform in the pandemic was to create that knowledge sharing and ideas like 15-Minute City, to spread those ideas and share, whether that's from Latin America or Europe or Australia. I mean, do you feel like the conversation around the potential and the future of cities has been raised to another level as a result of this?
Yes, because we've become even more virtual in the last 2 years than we were before. I was already talking about the fact that one of our real advantages is how quick good ideas spread now. At the beginning of my career, it took years for ideas to sort of penetrate and break through the barriers of media, regular mainstream media. So it would literally take a decade for something like the new urbanism to make traction. Look how fast the Paris 15-Minute City spread. And it's because of social media. It's because I've got over 100,000 Twitter followers who are not just regular folks interested in cities, and I love those regular folks, but it's also mayors and chief planners and media who are looking for good stories to tell in mainstream media. So our ability through conferences like yours, but also through just the ubiquitousness of the conversation about cities now, both in mainstream and social media, it's unprecedented. And it was unprecedented before the pandemic, and then it took another step up because we were all virtual and we had more time to do even more conferences because we could do them in our pajamas, in our home office or at home. So the speed at which good ideas spread is unprecedented and a huge advantage. What I say is I like to use the power of what I call inspiration and competition. For years, I've used the idea that mayors are all competing with each other, and they're competing with the mayor that had the job before them. They want to do good things. So when they hear good ideas, they're intrigued. And when their competing cities do a good thing, they want some of that credit too. So there's this masterful willingness to copy and steal ideas. And now we can have the conversation about how you shouldn't lazily copy things, but just that spirit of looking at what other cities are doing, that competition amongst mayors and decision makers is powerful, and the inspiration, where it's the public sending messages to the mayor saying, look at what Paris is doing, or what Barcelona did, or the unlikely heroes like Vilnius, Lithuania, and Oakland, California, who are my two favorite unlikely inspirational heroes. Because I often say that Paris is inspiring, Barcelona is inspiring, Copenhagen and Amsterdam and Utrecht are inspiring, London is inspiring lately in many ways. But these are huge, big world cities that are very sexy, but often feel too different to the vast majority of cities out there of a certain size and vintage and nature that don't see themselves in Paris at all. So it's when the unlikely heroes do something that I get really excited. When Oakland, California, at the beginning of the pandemic said, we're going to close 10% of our street system across the entire city to cars and open them to people across all neighborhoods, rich and poor, different socio-demographic characteristics. Just like that, suddenly everybody was talking about it and saying, well, why aren't we doing that? If Oakland, California, my favorite phrase, if fill in the blank city can do this, why can't we do this, right? So that's the power of the unlikely city, the city you don't expect. Similarly, Vilnius, Lithuania was the first European city to close the streets and it closed almost its entire downtown and made an open air cafe. And suddenly I was seeing Canadian cities like Calgary quoting Vilnius, Lithuania in their report to change the temporary rules for outdoor seating. And I'm pretty sure that's the first time they ever quoted Vilnius. So it's these cities that punch above their weight and are different. When Calgary does something and Edmonton does something on bike lanes, people say, wow, look at what Calgary did. When Birmingham, England just announced that they're essentially doing a car light center city, and Birmingham is known as a car-obsessed city in the UK. When they do it, suddenly all the other cities say, well, if they can do it, why can't we? So it's this power of inspiration and competition, but there's a particular power to the unexpected hero cities. They really spread like wildfire, is what I've observed.
So who are some of those kind of unexpected heroes? I mean, we've gone around the world here talking in London and Dubai and some of those cities, Singapore, Hong Kong, those major kind of global capitals. But if you wanted to recommend where should World City go next and have a conversation about urban innovation, who are some of those other unexpected heroes that you kind of admire, that you think are going to lead us into what the future of cities look like?
I'll talk about regions, areas of the world. The European cities, as I said, have been very good, like they did back in the 1970s during the oil crisis. They made permanent changes while North America went back to normal after the 70s oil crisis. Similarly now, they're making permanent changes. What they are probably the best at in the world at right now are, not all their cities, to be sure, but they're very good at taking those pre-existing plans they already had, addressing issues that are in people's faces, like urban pollution that's already affecting your health right now, and really putting that front and center instead of hoping that people will connect the dots to climate change, for example. Like, I'm big on making climate change front and center, but I admire the brilliance of Paris and Oslo and many other European cities saying this is about urban pollution, because we're already chewing on our air right now, and it's already making our kids sick. So we're going to address that. So they were already very good at connecting the dots for people and making decisive, permanent action around change in their cities to address crises, both long-term crises and immediate crises. The Latin American cities are just better than any other place in the world at knowing a good idea when they hear it, finding a way to do it cheaply, and just getting it done. And one of the reasons is many of their mayors only run one term at a time. You can't actually have a successive term. So each mayor comes in with a real intention to do something big, because they're not going to run again, at least not immediately after. So they have this culture of doing things quickly, a culture of experimentation, a culture of a lack of excuse. Jaime Lerner from Curitiba always said his main skill was the ability to recognize the difference between energy and excuse. And I really took that on board. And I see that in the Latin American cities, at least in their best moments. They do things quickly. I advised Medellin, Colombia for 2.5 years. And that city has been remarkable in its transformation. That's the city that brought in cable cars from the ski slopes and escalators from the shopping malls and used them as infrastructure to make their cities better, including in some of their poorest neighborhoods. So I've never been more inspired at any point in my career working all over the world than I was inspired working in Latin American cities like Medellin, Bogota, Santiago, etc. Because as much as I was teaching them, they were inspiring me. And it's about doing things faster, going faster and cheaper and more creatively, because you frankly have to. And the interesting thing is, some other cities might think, well, those are poor cities, they kind of have to. I haven't met that many cities that have unlimited money. I've even worked in Oslo, which is one of the richest cities in the world, and even they are pretty smart at using their money strategically, because nobody has unlimited budgets. We all have to be better at doing things faster and spending our money more strategically and matching our budgets and money spending to our actual vision, which is a whole conversation we could have just on its own. But where you put your money in your city building is critically important for actually achieving your vision.
Well, it sounds like we should have a World City Forum somewhere in Latin America next year. Lots to learn and be inspired with. I guess as kind of, the final word in terms of what do you think we'll be talking about a year from now or 2 years from now as we kind of move, hopefully, optimistically through this COVID crisis? Does it go back to climate change? Are we talking about downtowns, remote work? I mean, what's going to be the overarching theme that's going to be front and center for planners in the next couple of years in your mind?
Well, sadly, I'm not optimistic that we won't be still talking about pandemic-related issues and challenges, because I think we'll still be in some version of this. But even if we were out of it, my answer would be, I hope to God we're still talking about the same things. One of the real problems in our city building professions and our city building discussion is we can have shockingly short attention spans. This idea where we got to come up with a new buzzword because the last one is so last year, as if it were a dress. These ideas are fundamental ideas that, like justice or democracy, don't go away in a year. The crises that we're facing, the pre-existing crises, are going to be the crises we're facing next year and the year after that and the year after that. It might even be more urgent because the consequences will be much more obvious year after year. So, welcome to the new crises, same as the old crises. So I think we better be talking about those same things, because we're still going to be working to implement solutions, and implementation is still key. And God help us if we're still being distracted by new buzzwords or new goofy Elon Musk ideas that distract us from the fundamental solutions that will make our cities better. Because those fundamental solutions are not going to be different next year.
Well, thanks so much, Brent, for joining us, and great way to cap off what's been an incredible journey around the world over the last 3 days, and glad to have you part of that conversation. And we look forward to continuing that conversation, both with yourself and for everyone else that's joined us from World City and more than 80 different countries around the world as part of this event. We appreciate your time, and hopefully for all of the sessions that you missed are available to watch on demand over the next 6 months. I know there's more than enough content for all of us to digest and more than enough conversations to have for years to come. So thanks so much, Brent.
My pleasure, Chris.